Hey, Emma.
Yes, Madelyn.
What do you call the people who are sitting on the outside edge of the Teacups ride at Disney World?
I don't know. What do you call them?
The Outer Worlds. Hello, and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Like they're being spun around, like world.
Oh, I didn't get that part. I thought you were just playing off Disney World.
I know, I should have
like,
said, as I said Disney World, I was like, shoot, it should have been Disneyland.
Yeah.
But we
So
don't
it's
do
like,
second takes.
I don't remember the layout of Disney World. Are the teacup rides, like, on the edges? Near the gators or something?
World. W-H-I-R-L-E-D. World.
Yes, okay. That's a little better. I get it now.
Right, bumps it up to a 4 out of 10 joke.
Sure, yeah.
That might be generous.
Yeah.
Well, listeners, this is your 4 out of 10 host, Madelyn.
This is your other host, Emma.
Nice. Unrated. This is your host where they won't give...
I'm not your unrated host, Emma.
That's not what I meant like a video game, like a review site where they don't give scores anymore.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Not unrated.
Yes.
You're definitely rated host, Emma. You're E10 plus.
That's me.
And this week on the show, we're talking about controversial, underrated, overrated, quasi-sequel, old game, Chrono, and new game, underrated, overrated? I mean, you could say that about any game. The Outer Worlds.
Yeah, underrated and overrated are just so, like overrated just means, like, lots of people like something that I don't like. You know?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything. It just means you dislike something popular. And underrated just means you like something not popular.
But what happens when society has no opinion on it at all? What would you call it then?
Normal.
Unrated. Absolutely. So speaking of underrated and overrated and all the rateds, let's talk Chrono. So Chrono is a 1999 in Japan and 2000 in the West RPG from Squaresoft, pre-Enix, and it came out for the PlayStation 1. And it's technically, sort of, although, can you call it a sequel?
I mean, it brings in characters and events from the first game, so yes.
Except that the developers have sort of actively shied away from calling it a sequel. So,
I mean, whatever. I mean, it brings in things from Chrono Trigger, so even if it's not a direct sequel, it's in the series. I'm not getting into about the semantics of using the word sequel, okay?
Dang.
We're not doing that today.
All right, crossing off all of my notes. The etymology of sequel. You all missed a great lecture.
But yes, while we have technically talked about Chrono Trigger before, these games are different enough to sort of warrant sort of talking about them separately, as opposed to, like, you know, we've done, like, Final Fantasy as a whole, although maybe that will change now that that's an action RPG.
Look, we are, and this is the announcement, officially 100 main episodes in to Talk This. This is the 100th main episode here. So it may well be time to start mixing in some elements from series that we talked about in 2017.
Yes.
Maybe
so we have talked about 200 games now.
That's crazy.
I know. Who knew there were that many games?
Yeah, who knew there were 200 games? Not even including the games that were made from, like, what games don't count? Like 2016 to... No, I guess 2016 was in the new game at first. From 2015 to, like, 1997... No, to 2000.
What? 2000 counts.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I meant from 2010 to
Yeah,
2016.
it's not 20 years old. That would be hard.
You're right. Although Chrono Cross is 20 years old.
Yes, I'm just saying if we were only looking at games 20 years old or more, maybe we wouldn't have made it to
There'd be a lot more
games.
Arcade games.
Yes.
Anyway, Chrono Cross is technically a sequel or exists in the same world or whatever semantics you want to use, I won't lecture you, to Chrono Trigger, which you may recognize from Wikipedia's greatest games of all time list.
Yes.
Or you may
is Chrono Cross on there, or is it just Chrono Trigger?
I believe it is just Chrono Trigger.
Yeah. Everybody loves Chrono Trigger.
That's
what I know.
Chrono Cross may very well be like the best reviewed, hated sequel of all time.
Yeah.
Because Chrono Cross was a critical success, and even seemingly a, not like a smash commercial success, but enough of a commercial success to be a PlayStation Hits member.
Yep.
And despite that, it does have to live in the shadow of highly influential 1995 Super Nintendo Entertainment System RPG Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, so a lot of the backlash against it isn't necessarily anything to do with its own innate quality, but rather how very much not like Chrono Trigger it is. I was reading one retrospective that was like, it took everything that people liked about Chrono Trigger and then seemingly like isolated that and removed it to make something very, very different from Chrono Trigger.
Which, to be clear, both the director and the producer, I have lovely quotes from both of them talking about their design philosophy with this game. And let's talk a little bit about what the game is before I get into kind of the ethos of how do you make a sequel and how much do you change and creative freedom and all that. So in Chrono Trigger, you play as Surge, and you're a blue-haired teenage boy, 'cause it's an RPG, so who else would you be?
Yep.
And you, at some point at age 17, kind of accidentally discover this alternate reality where you drowned, I think at age 10? Or 10 years ago?
As a child.
As a child. Either at age 7 or age 10. I can't remember. So basically what you do is you live in this tropical island chain called El Nido, and you recruit a bunch of friends and allies to find, like, what's going on with this alternate reality that you're able to kind of move between. And the big friend of yours is named Kid. We love a good name like Kid. Kid and Champ McDude feel like they would get along.
Yeah.
Kid, who's this, like, sassy thief girl, is kind of your main friend and helps you travel between these two dimensions. And you're also fighting against Lynx, who's an anthropomorphic panther working for a supercomputer. And that is the amount of the game that is, sort of easy to understand.
Yeah. So Chrono Cross is one of those games, sort of like the Suikoden series, which I think we've also talked about, where there's 40 characters that you can recruit.
45,
whatever. That's a lot less than most of the Suikoden games, but that's still a lot versus, like, Trigger's very, like, finite party. And it's enough that you can't actually recruit all of them in one playthrough. You have to make use of New Game Plus to be able to have all of them in one save file. But even Kid, who's, like, one of the central pillars of the story, you can continuously not let her enter your party for a very long period into the game. And the plot will just deal with that. Which I think is really interesting, actually. That you can just keep saying, like, no, I don't want you in my party. Until it's finally like, no, she's important.
Well, as a game that deals with multiple dimensions, obviously, perhaps as expected, Also, given that this comes from our friends at Square, the plot is somewhat complicated. I always know it's bad news when the plot section on Wikipedia is long, because it means that somebody cared enough about the game to type a long and confusing summary for me of the game. Which is just like, oh no, this is too big for Madelyn's lore corner. But here's just a sprinkling of stuff that happens. Number one, everybody you loved from Chrono Trigger had bad crap happen to them. Many of them are dead. Often due to ignoble ways. Like, that in itself feels like just such a big, like, F you to, like, everyone who loved this highly classic game. It's like, you like that happily ever after we gave you? Too bad. Like, life sucks.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you know what, it's bold. Like, I don't mean to say that that's a decision you can't make, but it is sort of, it's a very bold storytelling choice to make a sequel that not only isn't really a sequel, but also is just like, screw all the characters that you cared so much about.
Yeah, something it reminds me of a little bit is like going from Final Fantasy X to X-2, except like the opposite, right? Like if Final Fantasy X is like your standard sort of Final Fantasy sort of tragedy, and then you go to Final Fantasy X, it's like, you're a pop star now. But it's like the opposite, right? Like Chrono Trigger, there's some sad moments, but ultimately it's an uplifting sort of story. And then you go to Chrono Cross and it's like very sort of dour. And I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way, just that the tone of it is much different. The writer also worked on Final Fantasy VII a little bit, and then Xenogears, which actually Xenogears was originally conceived of as a Chrono Trigger sequel and then became its own thing. So he was just like, he worked on Trigger and then he was like, here's another one. No, it's a different game. Okay, let's try that again.
They even did that with Chrono Cross. Chrono Cross was originally some kind of like weird side spin-off-y game that introduced Kid. And they
did release Radical Dreamers, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That's a separate thing.
I know, but it's also sort of a prototype for some of what they wanted to do here.
Well, they said this one started out as a remake of it.
Right.
So, yeah. I think that they're separate entities.
Fair enough, but they really made 3 sequels to that game, none of which were sequels.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff that goes on. There's clones of, super powerful beings. Lynx is your dad. You get...
Alan.
It's a 20-year-old game. You can only play it...
You can't just throw down Lynx as your dad.
Yes, I can. You can only play it through the PS3 PlayStation Network, which you can now only access on your PS3, which is gonna load... it's gonna take you 20 years to download this game.
I know. I don't understand Sony's changes to their store. My wish list has been erased. There are no search filters. Whose idea was this?
Simplify. We're out of server space.
I can't sort by price or title.
The point being, I'm sorry that I just threw a spoiler out there. It's really a mid-game spoiler for a 20-year-old game that you probably can't play. So I don't feel that bad. Maybe I mean,
as I read about it, I was like, I kind of want to play this. Alas, my selfless past self passed on my PlayStation 3.
I considered playing it. I ultimately played The Outer Worlds this week instead because it was on sale, and I don't know. I just kept flashing back to playing Vagrant Story, and I enjoyed Vagrant Story, but the playtime on this for one playthrough is 40 hours. And it's like, I'm not gonna get through it. So is
The Outer Worlds, to be fair.
Yeah, but The Outer Worlds is like Borderlands 40 hours, you know? I don't know. It's just different. The way the time is going to pass with this is different.
Sure.
And also, my boyfriend loves Fallout, so it felt like the right investment.
Sure, yeah.
Anyway, the point being, there's some crazy stuff that goes on in this game. Yeah. Like, there's something called the Time Devourer. Like, that's really all you need to know.
Wow, I'm really into that, to be honest.
The Time Devourer?
Yeah, that's
a
great.
band name.
I love that. Time Devourer.
All this to say, I was reading this and I was like, Square never change. And you've always been like this, haven't you?
Square makes a lot of things, you know? Square does Dragon Quest too, or was that Enix originally?
I think Enix was Dragon Quest originally.
Okay.
I think. I'm not saying that Square only makes games like this. I'm just saying games like this are often made by Square.
Sure.
Like, games that have 30-minute YouTube videos explaining the plot are often made by Square.
Okay.
Not always. I'm not saying they're always made by Square. I'm just saying I felt some Kingdom Hearts vibes from the clones and the darkness and the time travel and the multiple dimensions.
Okay.
That's all.
Another thing that's pretty complicated about Chrono Cross, and another point of contrast from Chrono Trigger, is its combat system is rather complex, or different, I guess. One, like, your characters are very customizable, so you can sort of train them into whatever sort of role that you want them to play. And also there's, like, a stamina system. So, like, each character has, like, 7 points of stamina, and then, like, actions spend that much stamina, and then doing something like waiting or guarding gives you back stamina. And sometimes you can go into negative stamina and then have to wait a turn. So instead of having just, like, standard turn-based stuff, they have, like, sort of this complicated thing going on where you have to manage, basically, your character's energy by doing different actions that affect it in different ways. So they very much added, like, a rather deep combat system that's not necessarily, like, was of the time, I guess, for RPGs.
Yeah, plus a sprinkle of, Final Fantasy VII materia crossed with Pokemon elemental types.
Yeah.
To be clear, it's not like Chrono Trigger had... I wouldn't describe Chrono Trigger's combat system as, like, standard RPG either, because it was like sort of turn-based, but not really turn-based.
Yeah.
So it's not like they took, like, a standard system and said, yes, I'm going to do this, but complicated.
Yeah.
It's like they took something that wasn't turn-based and turned it into turn-based plus, which is an interesting move. So another thing I thought was neat about this, so this game is really polarizing in terms of whether the story works or whether it doesn't. But the idea of traveling between the two parallel dimensions where you're meeting different versions of the same people is kind of neat. A neat idea. It did seem like your actions in one world could affect the other world, which didn't really track when I thought too hard about it. But
probably, maybe you're missing some context for one thing.
But I thought the idea was that the worlds split when I died or didn't die. And so why would one affect the other?
Again, I think maybe you're missing some context.
Or maybe it just doesn't pay to think too hard about games that featured time travel or multiple dimensions.
Okay.
But boy, Square had a real complex about the environment in the late 90s, huh?
Why?
Because this game is all about, has a big theme of humans kind of destroying the natural world and being just a destructive force. And Final Fantasy VII is kind of about that.
Yeah.
And it's just like, dang, they're feeling pretty stressed about climate change or whatever in, like, 1995 to 1999.
Yeah, I don't actually think, I think that's a theme that comes out even in some of their more modern ones, too. I mean, the whole idea of, like, Final Fantasy summons is, like, they are, like, different elements, right? So, of course, there's going to be some sort of theme brought into that from the environment.
And that makes sense. So let's talk about this as a sequel, shall we? And sequels in general. So Chrono Cross was well reviewed at the time. Got a perfect score from GameSpot. Got a 36 out of 40 from Famitsu. Like, by all accounts, it's a game that was, you know, critically liked and critically loved, even. And yet, when you read about it online now, there are certainly some, like, loving retrospectives of it, too, don't get me wrong. But it does feel like it's sort of settled into this world of, well, it's not Chrono Trigger, and we really wanted more Chrono Trigger.
Yeah. The retrospective I read compared it to 10-2 and then Lightning Returns as sort of, like, sequels with, like, some oddity that's, like, notable, right? Like, they're weird and they try things, right? But they often get, well, not Lightning Returns. Lightning Returns is generally favorably compared, but are sometimes compared to their initial thing as, like, they did something weird from where it started from.
Well, it's a weird conundrum to be in. So the director, Masato Kato, here's a quote from him about this. He says, "There's no use in making something similar to before. We're not so weak nor cheap," bold, as to try to make something exactly the same as Trigger. Accordingly, Chrono Cross is not Chrono Trigger 2. It simply doesn't follow on from Trigger, but is another, different Chrono that interlaces with Trigger. And then the producer, I won't read this quote directly, but also talked about basically, you know, this is a computer game, right? And even though it's like an RPG, it's a computer RPG. And so it's always going to be tied to the console and what you can do on the console. And that, you know, moving from SNES to PlayStation gave them more ways to play around with the hardware. And so sort of naturally, it was going to be a different game because they had different opportunities to use that. But both of them talk about it as it being like almost a stronger artistic choice to do it that way, if that makes sense. The producer, Tanaka, did mention that, you know, there's sort of the method of doing sequels where you're just like improving on the basic sequel, the basic system that you already have. But they preferred this method where you were just like trying to make the best possible game you could for the console you were using. So it's an interesting contrast in what might be kind of two different ethoses for making a sequel, where I feel like most people just do the, well, let's just try to improve a little bit on what we did.
Yeah. But you know what? I read a review, and you can run from boss battles if it's not going well. And I say, why didn't every game do that going forward?
I don't know.
Like a lot of, like, despite all like the complexity, like some of the reviews were talking about like some of the convenience in the design, like that, like being able to run from any encounter, right? Like, that's so nice. Why don't JRPGs do that?
To punish
why do RPGs insist on being as unwieldy and player unfriendly as possible?
To punish you.
I know, basically.
Get good.
Yes, get good at navigating through rows and rows of menus.
Exactly.
That's what I'll work on.
A few little fun tidbits from the development. Apparently, I mean, not so surprisingly. So, like, the writer wrote, like, the main scenario, right? And there were teams that wrote the side quests, because all of these characters have kind of side quests where you get to know them. And apparently it was really hard with the parallel worlds situation to write side quests, which, like, you just don't think about. But I can imagine how tricky that must be, that, like, things have to change accordingly.
Yeah.
And I also like this quote talking about the character creation process. He said, "We also said things like, we need at least one powerful mom. no way we're gonna go without a twisted brat. It's like, I like that. I like that as a character creation, kind of. Like, no way, we need to have at least one powerful mom.
This one lists giant voodoo doll, mushroom man, baby alien as some highlights.
Perfect. There's some real dark moral choices in this game, though.
I mean, it's a lot more dour than Chrono Trigger.
Like, you can murder species.
Why not?
I did see one article about this talking about, and again, this is interesting because it's sometimes something you see with series, but sometimes they kind of just tread water and stay in the same place. Of talking about, okay, so if Chrono Trigger was the game you played when you were like 15, then this is the game that you play now that you've grown up a little bit. And it's a little bit darker and heavier because of that.
Yeah.
But I've grown up a little bit, and I still don't want to have to murder the Mama Hydra, or whatever it is that everybody talks about. Still feels kind of dark. Anyway, overall, I sort of feel like, I don't know, I really respect when people do something wildly different with a sequel. But I've also not really had it happen too much to games that I care about a lot. So I realize I may be saying that from a more academic place than I am from the pure upset of not getting Chrono Trigger 2.
Yeah. I mean, I had an example, and now I can't remember what it is.
Well, I was thinking of Yakuza 7, which of course you are playing now.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's that. And then, like, the opposite would be Final Fantasy, but I've only really gotten into that now that they are,
bad.
Action.
Says the internet. Now that they're bad.
Sure, yeah, now that they're bad. But no, now that they're action, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure that was an adjustment for a lot of people, either hopping into 14 or 15, right?
I hear you, but Final Fantasy is not a sequels game.
Yeah, but they're still, like, the same thing, right? Like, they've taken Final Fantasy and they're, like, improving the Final Fantasy formula is the idea between each one, right? Like, it's the same sort of system, just slightly different. And then they were like, now you're action. So, because, people didn't like 13, so they were like, we gotta do a very drastic change.
I hear you. I just think it's less, whatever. Like, from my perspective, I think it's less fair to complain about big shifts in Final Fantasy, which is an anthology series, where, heck yeah, I think they should be able to...
But, they went 13 plus sequels games being like this turn-based stuff. I don't know. I'm just saying there are people who are like huge Final Fantasy fans. Like, I played all Final Fantasies. Like, those are real people. So I think that it's a fair comparison, and you don't have to be devil's advocate every time.
I'm not being devil's advocate. I just think that I genuinely think, like, Final Fantasy is an anthology series. Like, you don't like what they did this game? Hopefully the next one is better. I think Final Fantasy would be dope if it was 15 100% different games that had nothing in common, except they were all called Final Fantasy.
Yeah, but again, that's what you're saying from an academic perspective,
yeah,
right? Because you don't have that connection to Final Fantasies 1 through, 10.
Well, maybe I would if they made them, like, available to play anywhere.
What do you mean? They're all on Steam.
For Mac?
I don't know.
Yeah, me either. Maybe they are all available to play, whatever. It's more of a point of bringing us back to Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, which are not... Chrono Cross especially is not very accessible, but even Chrono Trigger...
It's on the DS. It's the most latest one.
The DS is not an accessible system anymore.
It was until 6 months ago. Or whatever.
I know, but now it's not.
Well, Nintendo doesn't care. Nintendo's going to re-release Chrono Trigger for 1 month only. So.
Yeah. I can't lie. I was thinking, like, why haven't these games been released on the Switch? Like, these feel like natural games to re-release on the Switch, but I guess they're waiting for the right 3-month window.
Yeah, Chrono Trigger was 1997, right?
I think it's 95 in Japan. It might be 97 in the US.
95? Well, whatever. So 2025, fall, they're going to be like, it's the 30th anniversary of Chrono Trigger, so you get 3 months and 0 days to buy it.
They should have done 25th anniversary, though. Missed opportunity. Who cares about 30?
That's true. They got too many other anniversaries this year, you know. Mario.
It's not a Nintendo game, though.
Whatever.
Does Square not want money?
No.
Feels like a Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross packaged remaster would make a lot of money.
Square's not interested in making money.
Apparently not. Have you seen how Avengers did? Yikes.
Yeah.
Apparently they are not very interested in making money. Anyway, speaking of making money at the expense of all else, shall we talk The Outer Worlds?
Let's talk about it.
Alright, it's RPG week here on Talk This.
Yes, one JRPG, one WRPG, as I call them.
WRPG.
Western RPG.
It should be American RPG, because then it would be RPG. I kind of like that.
I guess Obsidian is in the US, so that's fine. You can call it an American RPG.
Even if it was Canada, it would still be an American. Then I guess we could make it a RPG, but I don't like that. It sounds like crappy G. Anyway, The Outer Worlds is an first-person RPG from Obsidian that came out for pretty much all the modern platforms in 2019, and then just had a Switch version release in June. So you can play this one pretty much anywhere on pretty much any system, and it's even on Steam now for all you Epic Game Store haters.
Yeah.
Although it was also on the Microsoft Store, so it wasn't technically an Epic Games exclusive, so get over yourselves. The Wikipedia page even noted, like, the announcement of this was met with negative response.
Yeah.
When it talked to it, I was like, yikes. Like, that's the understatement of the year.
I mean, I don't remember when it was announced. Like, maybe it was, like, one of the first things that was announced as an Epic Store exclusive.
I'm not saying that The Outer Worlds in particular had, like, an incredibly negative backlash to being on the Epic Store. I'm just generalizing.
I think, though, it was announced, like, there was a Game Awards where, like, a lot of games were announced as, like, Epic Game Store exclusives. Like, I think it was announced at the same one, like, Hades was announced at. And that was also Epic Games exclusive for a while, was in early access. So I feel like I remember there being, like, an event, and I think maybe The Outer Worlds was one of them, where, like, people became aware of, like, the Epic's Game Store and their new strategy of exclusives and stuff, and that's where sort of I'm making hand gestures.
Yes.
To simulate explosion.
Anyway, let's move away from the Epic Game Store. You can listen to any of our podcasts about games that were Epic Game Store exclusives to find our feelings about the matter.
Yeah.
But The Outer Worlds is kind of the spiritual successor to Fallout. It was made by two of the Fallout guys, and obviously by the studio that made Fallout New Vegas.
Yes.
There's a lot of similarities.
The one that people like.
You say that, but I said that to Josh, that it's made by the people who made New Vegas, and he was like, New Vegas is terrible.
See, I've always heard of, like, New Vegas is the one that people like, but, you know, maybe not.
He had issues, apparently, with it being buggy.
Oh, Fallout being buggy. Wow. That's a rarity.
Look, you take it up with him, okay?
Maybe the older ones are less buggy, but I know that, like, 4 is really buggy, and then, of course, there was Fallout 76.
Anyway, The Outer Worlds takes place in the colonies of Halcyon,
Yep.
which is a star system 10 light years from Earth or something like that.
Something that's in space.
And it takes place a couple hundred years in the future, I think, if I'm remembering right. But it takes place in an alternate universe where, and I love this because it is such a unnecessarily nerdy way of justifying something that you did not need to justify. But it takes place in an alternate universe where U.S. President William McKinley was not assassinated. Did you remember that William McKinley was one of the presidents that is assassinated? Maybe you did. Maybe you didn't. Anyway, as a result of that, Teddy Roosevelt never kind of became the president, and so the Gilded Age and all the big, robber barons and all that good stuff never got broken up with his antitrust bustin' big stick. And so as a result, there's a, to quote Wikipedia, hyper-corporate, class-centric society dominated by the power of mega-corporations.
Yes.
Which didn't feel like it needed the retconning of William McKinley's assassination to really hit home.
I wonder if it's like a point in a side story or something.
I mean, so all of the corporations have these kind of like old-timey names with the idea of, I guess they were the corporations that were around in the McKinley era. And yeah.
Well, I mean, some of them are like Spacer's Choice, though, so that probably wasn't named until they went to space.
It was like Auntie Chloe is one of the companies, though.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, maybe. Anyway, I thought that was so funny when I read it, because, like, what a bizarre piece of lore.
Having played the first few hours, I can tell you that they don't give you a summary of history. So I wonder if that just comes up as like a piece of trivia and got added to the Wikipedia page.
I'm not saying it's not just a random piece of trivia, but even as a random piece of trivia, like, what a bizarro, what a, like, strange little justification for your corporate hellscape in the future that you've made.
You gotta come up with something, right? Some sort of history for your world.
But, like, normal history seems fine.
Okay, yeah, sure.
That's my point. I'm like, really? Does that seem that unbelievable that in a couple hundred years that... I mean, we're already dominated by mega corporations. How different is that from... except it's in space?
Sure.
That's my only cynical point about that, is you didn't have to work quite so hard to get me to buy into this.
Listen, man, they came out last year, and the world was the same, but people didn't think about it then.
What a way to put it. Anyway, this one is the game that I played some of this week. I really only played about the first hour, to be totally transparent. And I spent about half of that in the character creator. Of course, yeah. Does.
I don't even remember what my character looked like. You don't see yourself very often.
Yeah, it's a first-person game, so I did spend a lot of time trying to create my face in the game in order to then, never, ever see it.
Yeah.
But it did look sort of like me. Hair wasn't right, but what can you do?
Yeah, I played like 4 to 5 hours of it, I think, and it is still on my list of games to go back to, but that list is many games long. So one day...
I am going to give this one a shot. I've realized that I now have too many games that I'm playing at once, but you know me. Remember that podcast
No such thing!
Like, you should be playing 10 games at once?
I remember when you said that.
I do too. But I'm going to try it. It is a first-person shooter. However, I did see some of the negative reviews where the big negative was the combat is too easy. And you know what? That sounds calibrated to me.
Yeah.
The combat is too easy? You betcha. It took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to switch between weapons so I could use my melee weapon when the guys got close. So that's where we're at with skill level on this. I blame the game. It did not teach me that soon enough.
Sure.
You don't sound convinced.
Sure.
Anyway, I am already enjoying the kind of conversation system element of it. That's kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And it does feel... We talked, and I can't remember on what podcast this was, but we talked about how game RPGs often kind of lean into the points system of RPGs and eschew the role-playing element.
Yeah.
Oh, it was about
I think it was on Disco Elysium.
Thank you. I couldn't remember the name, but it was on the Disco Elysium episode. And The Outer Worlds does feel like it leans a bit more into the role-playing-iness. Granted, with a heavy backing of where you assign your points. But leans a little bit more into the role-playing element than many of these so-called RPGs, especially WRPGs.
I mean, the points, if I remember correctly, are about, like... It's not like you're putting it into strength and defense, right? Like, you're putting it into, like, your mechanical knowledge or your smarts or your physical strength.
So at the beginning of the game, you're able to assign some characteristics that stay the same throughout the game. So you can decide if your character is smart or dumb. You can decide... Obviously, you have a limited number of these, right? Like...
Yeah.
Obviously, if you could just choose, you'd be super smart and super strong and super technically knowledgeable. But you can choose if you're smart or dumb. You can choose if you're kind of physical, stamina. You can choose more about like your charmingness.
Yeah.
I almost made my character dumb because it said it unlocks the dumb dialogue options, and that was almost tempting enough for me, but I didn't do it. But then you have a point system where, like you said, no, some of them do seem to be more combat related. Like, there are definitely some that have to do with how much you can carry and how much your melee does.
Sure.
But there are a lot of them that are medical knowledge and, like, engineering knowledge and all that stuff, which is kind of a neat twist.
Yeah. Of course, you can always eschew dialogue and just shoot everybody instead if you really want to.
That is true, and I almost shot someone I could talk to right away in the game. I thought everyone on the planet... So here's what happens. Like, I should probably lay this out a little bit more for those of you who are not familiar with the game. Basically, in this year, it's like 2300 something, I think. Although I may be taking that from Chrono. I think both of these games take place in, like, the couple hundreds of years.
It's in space.
It's in space.
Doesn't really matter what year it is.
Anyway, so basically to reach these colonies that these corporations are pushing people from Earth to colonize. So to reach Halcyon, you have to take a 10-year sleepy trip, as I wrote it in my notes. Where, you know, you're put into cryogenic sleep for 10 years, and you wake up, and you're at the new planet. And they sent 2 big ol' ships at first, I think. But the Hope, which was carrying a lot of the smart and the best and brightest of humanity, got lost mysteriously.
That's why you spread out your best and brightest among a few different ships.
Well, unless you're deliberately trying to get rid of the best and brightest so you can be corporate overlords to the rest, which I have a feeling is where this is going. That's not based on it. Like, that's not a spoiler. Maybe it is. It's just a spoiler based on my... That's probably what I would do if I was a corporate hellscape overlord.
True.
Which, don't we all aim to be corporate hellscape overlords one day? You know, the salary, the benefits. Anyway, so it's 70. So the Hope, like, disappeared. It's been hanging out on the edge of the galaxy, and the people have been in this cryogenic sleep for 70 years, which unsurprisingly is not that good for you. You're not really supposed to sleep for that long.
Yeah.
So anyway, the mad scientist Phineas Wells somehow finds this ship. Not really clear how he does that yet to me, but he does. And he decides to revive you. For some reason.
Yep.
He's got like this like special stuff he gives to you. Special stuff, that probably is the technical term. That makes it so that you can wake up from your 70-year sleep without literally exploding, basically. And so he needs your help to get more of that stuff to wake everybody else up so that he can overflow the space archipelago with super smart folks and overthrow the kind of corporate board that oversees it all. She has a real Philosopher King's Plato angle to it, I feel like.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the nuts and bolts. And then, you land on a thing in Halcyon, and it's your job, as Emma said, to either shoot your way to overthrowing the corporations or to talk and lie and scheme and sneak your way to doing it.
I did do a lot of stealing. That's what I remember doing.
I do like stealing things.
You also get a few different companions during your adventures who will, help you make decisions by expressing their opinions sometimes. As well as you can just talk to them and do their side quests and stuff, and they will fight with you. And assuming you don't have the highest difficulty turned on, they will not die. But they will, if you do.
Well, there you go.
I was reading their QA team put out like a tweet thread on this one particularly serious but hard to find bug that was happening after release that was causing problems because it was about like companions dying. And since the hardest difficulty has permadeath on them, that was causing, some problems of that. Just like companions would just sometimes randomly die. Like there would be no combat. They couldn't figure out what was causing it. And apparently, after a while, they figured out that there's like a ladder bug where the companion would start climbing a ladder and the ladder would go on really, really, really high into infinity, and then they would fall off the ladder and hit the ground and die.
Yikes.
So there was this whole thread of like things he tried and like things like ideas he had for what was happening, and it just turned out that there was some issue with the ladders and they were climbing it and then they fell and died. It's just funny.
QA is crazy, dude.
Well, when you have a game that has this, like, complicated, right? Like, any RPG, basically, where there's lots of decisions and lots of AI doing lots of things, it's very hard to, like, even before release, isolate every single issue that might be in there, right? Like, all games ship somewhat buggy. It's just a matter of trying to identify bugs as things that don't need to be fixed. Right? And then every once in a while, a player base will find a very serious bug that you wouldn't have known if you didn't have, like, a huge player base testing it, right, for you. Yeah.
There's something very metaphorical, I feel like, about climbing a gigantic ladder to nowhere and then fall. Like, that feels in keeping with the spirit of the game. They should have left it in there. It's like, well, that's what happens when you try to climb the corporate ladder.
Yeah, the major criticism I've seen sort of levied at the Outer Worlds story is that it's very anti-capitalist, right? Like, it's like, capitalism's bad. And then it sort of stops, right? Like, that's the statement, right? It's like, capitalism's bad, and there's no, like, after that. Like, that's the entire thought of, like, the criticism that they have and the aesthetics of the world is that capitalism's bad, and then there's no, like, alternative or elaboration on that or anything in particular. It's just sort of base statement, and that's as deep as it goes.
Well, it's telling that Phineas's solution to that isn't, lead some kind of proletariat workers' uprising, or educate the people into realizing that capitalism is bad. His solution is, let's get the smart people back in here, and they should rule us instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, that's probably better. Maybe.
Getting a few smart people to maybe help lead a, proletariat revolution. Maybe that should have been the process there. As it is, it's mostly like, here's some smart people. They'll fix it.
They're the kings now.
Yeah, that was another sort of critique in that, like, the game is very responsive on a minor level, right? Like, little actions you do, the game will notice that and react to it. But then it doesn't feel like any of those minor things then translate to any sort of, like, major shift in the world outside of, like, your ending.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, they shift
like, you
in
get
kind
the
of
good or bad ending.
RPG points kind of ways. I'm excited to keep playing and get to see more of the flaws and perks system.
Oh, sure. I mean, your character... What I mean is, like, the world doesn't change
right.
based on your actions very heavily.
Right. I just thought it's cool that the game even is able to... Like, all the reviews talked about... Apparently all the reviewers are really bad with robots. Because all of them talk about how their like, it eventually offered them the option to make their character permanently scared of robots because they were so bad at robots. And it's like, you know, like, that's a neat little RPG trick there. So it is cool how they're able to change a lot of the gameplay experience and the things that you're allowed to do to fit the RPG element of it in a way that I feel like many games in this style don't. But you're absolutely right to say, yeah, ultimately what happens... I mean, I didn't read too much about it, to be honest, because I do want to play the game. But it does not surprise me that much that ultimately the path of the story isn't impacted that much by your role-playing choices.
Yeah.
These two games together are an interesting pair.
Yeah.
Because I'm not totally transitioning into mashup yet, but I'm dipping my toe.
I mean, we probably should, because this is already getting pretty long for an episode.
Word. So, they're interesting because they are both RPGs, and in many ways, they are both very standard RPGs of their kind, with some spicy twists.
Sure.
You know, like Chrono Cross's combat, while it does have the kind of wonky stamina system and weird stuff, is, you know, fundamentally very recognizable as this is a turn-based RPG combat with a little bit of a kick to it.
Sure.
In the same way, The Outer Wilds is very much this kind of Western dystopia-style RPG. And yeah, it leans a little bit more into the role-playinginess of it. And yeah, it leans a little bit more into the you don't have to fight-ness of it. But it is very much the game of that style. And both of them are about those genres, kinds of varieties of chosen ones, which I thought was another interesting contrast. In that, in Chrono Cross, you're almost this kind of like divinely chosen, you're gonna set things right hero. Whereas in The Outer Worlds, you're this very Western Fallout style, like, you've emerged from the vault. And it's not a literal vault in this game, but it almost might as well be. Kind of chosen one. So those are motifs that I'd like to see incorporated in our mashups.
Yeah.
Okay. But the problem is, of course, that they are very, like... It's just like, I should take the gameplay of one and mash it into the story of the other. And vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that a little bit lately, because I was thinking about, like a dragon. And this isn't entirely true, but in some ways it feels like sort of more the Western RPG type story in that it's reality, right? And then, like, they've brought it into sort of the standard JRPG gameplay. And that's not, like, 100% correct, right? Because it's still very Japanese in its story, obviously.
Right.
But, yeah, like, I was thinking about, like, the potential of that, like, bringing, like, the standard JRPG, like, kill god story and applying it to more Western design principles when it comes to RPGs and
but
vice versa.
Almost what The Outer Worlds wants to be, right? Except that the god is money.
I guess so. But you're not really destroying it, though. Like, your goal isn't necessarily to dismantle capitalism in The Outer Worlds.
But maybe in the mashup it should be. That's what I'm saying. That
okay.
The god in our mashup is money, is capitalism, and is money.
Sure. Okay. So we must kill and dethrone Rockefeller.
Yeah. Exactly. Done. That's it.
Okay.
Kill Rockefeller the game.
No.
In multiple dimensions.
Yes, there's multiple versions of Rockefeller. You know what? There's some idea for, like, commentary in that, right? Like, of, like, the same people being powerful in each dimension because, like, the idea of, like, wealth systems
like
are...
the generational wealth commentary.
Eternal. Yeah.
That's interesting. And at first in this game... Okay. Something's coming together here. So at first in this game, so you can travel between dimensions. You're this kind of, like, Gilded Age hero. Whatever. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the Gilded Age, but work with me. In fact, it probably shouldn't. It's probably more impactful if it's modern. But you've discovered the ability to move between dimensions. And at first... you're doing, like, little things, right? You're doing, like, standard RPG kind of fetch questy kind of stuff, like the stuff that you do in the Outer Worlds, thinking that this is going to change society. That by doing these little things, like helping people recycle and teaching people how to set up their bank account. All of this sounds very boring, but this is less boring. Like, this is the same amount of boring as any other RPG quest, right? It's just like you go to the bank and get the card for them as opposed to getting the power generator.
Sure.
So at first you're doing all these little things, thinking this is going to make an impact. And then you switch to the other dimension and you realize that it hasn't made an impact. Because these kinds of small scale change isn't enough to dismantle the existing power structure.
Sure.
And at some point you get body swapped with Rockefeller. And that's when you can, because there's body swapping in Chrono Cross. I don't know.
Okay.
But anyway, at some point the game transitions into more of this. Maybe it turns from first person to more of a turn-based RPG once you start to fight God. In some way.
I don't think you have to do that. I think that would not be well received, but...
Okay, fine. The idea being, eventually you start to fight these much more you have to take on these much more powerful systemic issues. It's a very boring game, maybe.
No, it's the same format as any RPG, right?
Yeah.
Or any JRPG, right? Like, you never start out on your adventure being like, I'm gonna dethrone God today. Like, generally it's like, oh, my village needs, like, a thing. I'm gonna go get it. Whoops, I've tripped headfirst into a world-spanning quest.
But I like the idea of our protagonist thinking that by doing all these little things that they are kind of doing their part to dethrone God, and then eventually realizing that that's actually not really doing anything. I like the crushing despair of that.
Well, like, maybe, like, you're going, like, from village to village, and then you circle back around to the other village, and all the problems you helped solve are back there again, right? Because a short-term solution is only going to help for the short term. So, like, as you're going around trying to help people, like, you come back, and you're like, oh.
Or to mess around
Did I come to this village?
Or to mess around even more with the kind of the morality system elements of both of these games a little bit. That sometimes you help a village, and they, because of that, become more prosperous, and as a result, they actually begin to exploit another village that you've helped. And completely undo, and then some, the work that you've done.
That's pretty good, too, yeah.
But then I don't know how to transition from that into, like, killing the dollar.
I mean, the same way anything transitions, right? Like, it's just the same, you just take, like, the standard JRPG plot structure of small to big, except you're just applying it to a different set of thematic and aesthetic elements.
But see,
I don't think it's that.
Feel like,
it's not that complicated.
I feel like you could switch to turn-based, because the way that you're going to overthrow the dollar is by the proletariat bonding together into, like, armies, and then it becomes like a Fire Emblem game.
Sure.
That'll be the DLC.
Okay.
It turns the second half of the game into Fire Emblem.
Sure.
You're not convinced?
No.
Anyway, there also have to be, like, clones and robots and stuff. Like, there's got to be some crazy things going on behind the scenes.
Sure.
What do you think of this game?
It's good. I like it. I like the idea.
Any other critiques or elements you'd like to add before we wrap up for the day?
Nope.
Amazing. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Do you have any thoughts on this episode? How do you think we should dethrone the almighty dollar? Do you prefer JRPGs or RPGs?
RPGs.
Did you play Chrono Trigger and or Chrono Cross, and do you share the internet's assessment that Chrono Cross just ruined Chrono Trigger? Not all of the internet, but you know, the angry internet's opinion. Do you think
the loud internet?
Do you think that Nintendo should release Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross as a timed exclusive for their 30th anniversary?
No.
Do you think that the leak of the DLC for the Outer Worlds this week is accurate? Anyway,
I don't know.
If you have thoughts on any of that or anything else we talked about this episode, you should hit us up on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and YouTube. It's been weeks, and it's still very hard for me to say all 4 of those. Anyway, we're on all 4 of those social media platforms at Talk This Podcast. And you should follow us there for updates and occasional thoughts. And to keep up on what is going on the blog. So for that, you can also go directly to our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, see the games that Emma's about to pick from the hat, and like I said, check out our blog, where you can read long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, which has a new edition up about TV's thoughts on the Kingdom Hearts Melody of Memory demo, featuring some of my most elaborate, dumb Kingdom Hearts memes to date. And also Split Screen, where Emma and I are watching Coffee Prince and My Hero Academia. So some good stuff there. You'll want to check it out. Finally, if you like the show, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcasts, Pocket Casts. Anywhere that you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. And folks, thanks for hanging out with us for 100 main episodes as of today. It's really exciting, and it's crazy that we've been doing Talk This for coming up on 4 years now. And yeah, anyone who's listened to us anywhere in that history, we celebrate you, and thanks for listening. So Emma, what's going to be what's going to be episode 101? Main episode 101.
Our old game is going to be Mafia.
Nice.
And our new game is going to be Spiritfarer.
Those will work great together.
You are a repentant mafioso who must help the spirits of those he killed passed on.
So, Yakuza 8. Or...
That's a good idea.
It's already lit.
Psychic Yakuza? That's pretty good.
That is pretty good. Sega, you listening? Anyway, next week, it's that time in our side quest rotation where we talk about what we've been playing the last 6 weeks. It's going to be a good episode, I think. I think we've got some fun variety of content.
Yeah.
Or we'll just only talk about Yakuza and Kingdom Hearts.
Probably.
One of those 2 things. So if that sounds appealing to you, or if a wide variety of content sounds appealing to you, hey, check it out next Sunday at noon, because it will probably be one of those 2 things. So that's it for this week's episode of the show. Thanks as always. Thanks to Emma. Thanks to the listeners. And Emma, do you want to give us a sign-off, or do you want me to do a sign-off? Who's doing the sign-off?
This week, I hope that your alternate universe self is doing fine.